Morning, dear viewers. As you can see, it's a lovely dreary morning in the Netherlands today. Now, behind me you can see a part of the port of Rotterdam, small part of it. And I thought, since people were complaining about the production values in my videos, what I thought I'd do is I'd show them a little bit around my town, show them a little bit around parts of the Netherlands. Use a bit of that as a background footage so that it's not just still images of me sitting in my office. So just over there is big dry docks and production facilities where they build the units for the North Sea oil rigs. They build the oil rigs themselves. And just across the river, which you can't see from here, is the biggest petrochemical industry in Europe, where a huge amount of the oil and other petrol-related products for the consumer market are transformed. So crude comes in here, gets transformed into petrol, diesel and so on for your cars, but they also make all kinds of stuff like paints, industrial cleaners, all kinds of stuff. Anyway, I thought the port would be a good setting to talk about the topic that I want to talk about today, which is new colonialism and white supremacy. Now, you see, the thing is, I actually think that there are some superficial things in our society still today that are kind of a legacy of things past that could still be called sort of vestiges of white privileges and white supremacy in a way. So I'm going to talk about that. But first, a change of setting. Well, here we are in a lovely little secluded spot in the town, surrounded by genuine old buildings, some of which are just completely falling apart, really, because that's a downside. Old buildings are expensive to maintain. Yeah, you've seen some windmills and stuff. This town has 7 windmills surrounding the city centre. It used to be 20 back in the olden days. And it has about as many churches. Two things very typical of the Netherlands. Everyone has their own church because they split over something or other. One of the major church splits in the 20th century was actually over whether or not the snake literally spoke. Oh, well. Now you've got some church bells, actually.
Right, so turns out it was raining, and it's been raining for the last few days, which made the lens fog up, so I couldn't film. So I'm just going to use some stock footage from something or other Dutch to cover this while I speak. Right, so the topic I wanted to talk about is white privilege. Why do leftists talk about white privilege? I actually can think of some examples of why you could get the impression that Western civilization, Western values, white values as they call them, and I would agree with them to an extent that Western values and whiteness are tied together, insofar as you can call it whiteness, but you know. To give some examples, right? Everyone in the world wears Western clothing. Everyone wears a suit if they're being in polite society. Everyone wears baggy jeans and hoodies and all these other Western styles. The Xi Jinping of China does not walk around wearing traditional Qing dynasty robes or anything. This might have been quite different if other powers had been dominant over the world. We might be wearing robes today, we might be wearing Islamic clothing or a fez or something, but as it is, everyone in the world is wearing suits. And when Xi Jinping comes to a conference, he shakes your hand. He doesn't bow. This is quite a thing, of course. For example, in the Islamic world, especially handshakes between the sexes, very much a taboo thing. It's a point of discussion in many times in politics that Muslims refuse to shake the hands of women or vice versa. So that's an example. Another example, which might be more controversial, is pornography. If you go to a porn site right now and you open it up, you'll notice that almost every single person on the front page will be a white woman. And everything else is a fetish subcategory, right? So the white woman is sort of presented as the aesthetic beauty standard. And I would, of course, say that is because white women objectively are the most beautiful. But the left rhetoric would be because white women are being imposed on the rest of the world as a form of sort of white supremacy. But as it will be the trend in many of these things, this idea of it being white supremacy or white privilege, how does it exactly benefit white society as a whole to have women in pornography? And how does it benefit these women in general? I mean, porn actresses tend to be quite mentally damaged by it. It's not healthy for you to do that sort of thing. It's quite self-destructive. And in many ways, all of these things that are supposed proof of white privilege, like some of our aesthetic norms and some of our customs having become the global norm, they don't benefit us in any way. It's just, okay, it's slightly easier for us to interact with Japanese or Chinese because we don't have to learn their customs because they've adopted our customs. Same thing goes for economic things, like the idea that, and this is a bit more solid, I think, where the IMF, the American dollar system, are the global dominators in the world economy, and we exploit low wages in the third world and in Africa and slave labor, all of that indirectly, of course, but the Western economic system does enable it in a way, because we're the consumers of these products and we need these raw materials and these cheap wages to fuel our economies. And in a way, we've just kind of outsourced all our slave and child labor to the third world, so we can be more passive consumerists and don't have to work hard for the products we get. So in a way, that does somewhat benefit us. On the other hand, the people who most benefit from this exploitative system are, of course, the shareholders of mega corporations and their CEOs. And moreover, the fact that we've destroyed our manufacturing industry and our own domestic production has become increasingly destructive to ourselves as well. It's increasingly become the motor of destroying our middle class and our working class and bringing people to poverty and state dependence, while it's been creating a middle class that's doing better and better in India and China. So is it white supremacy that we've become lazy consumerists who don't produce anything and we've raised up India and China? I don't know. I mean, to an extent it was in the beginning, I think. But again, it's not us very much who benefits. And that's kind of the trend of all of these things. Every remnant of our world hegemony, as it is, cultural, economic, social, more and more is not in our favor. And is, in fact, the way that the left sees it, with these white privilege things, these are used as bludgeons against us. Oh, pollutants, you had the Industrial Revolution, therefore world pollution is your fault. While it's, of course, not Western countries doing the polluting. Of course, us consuming, we indirectly support it and make it possible. And, they have this saying, ethical consumption in capitalism is not possible. I'd say ethical consumption is almost never possible unless you make a very, very localized economy. Because otherwise you're always exploiting someone or something, environment, labor, and so on. So these things are just used as bludgeons against us, and less it benefits us. All of these international structures that are leftovers from, well, the American and British empires mainly, they're just used as historic arguments against why we should never be allowed to be self-assertive or anything, despite all the good things that's done for the planet in many ways. So that's kind of the thing I wanted to mention, is that I do see the point of leftists when they talk about white privilege to an extent. And on the surface, there are many of these things, right? There is still the global dominance of the euro and the dollar, and international policy is set, of course, by America and international congresses, who are dominated, of course, by Western powers. But less and less that's to the benefit of the average white person, because these things are not really run by white people. The vast majority of white people don't really have a say or any influence over the decisions of these big top powers. So it's all surface. It's all, the fact that they wear suits and the fact that they do handshakes and the fact that they treat women the way we do, that's all proof that of white privilege and white supremacy over the world. While at the same time, this is rotting us from the inside and destroying the entirety of our people. So that's kind of the thing. And I do think it's valuable to allocate some time to researching and reading and confronting these leftist arguments of why they see things the way they do, because at least the more reasonable ones will many times not have thought about this very much. I remember when I was a 16-year-old communist and I was very concerned about pollution and so on and fascism, and I never thought to myself why I thought these things. And later when I was 20, 25, that I start really thinking about why I had these assumptions. And it happened many times because someone gave me arguments or confronted things I held to be true with perspectives I hadn't had before. So if you can, it's sometimes valuable to engage with these leftist arguments and debunk them, or try and give them a different point of view or a different perspective on the exact. You can have the exact same thing and give a different perspective on it, right? A different background, a different reasoning. So I think that's valuable. I think the distributist tries to do this to some extent. He tries to engage with this pop culture leftism. I think the mistake he makes that it's just the pop culture, it's just the YouTubers and the already convinced ideologues who are not going to be shifted from their position, and it turns into just a shouting match. I think it's more productive to look at academic papers, the more intellectual arguments the left mainly used to have, but they still do. And to try and counter those, to give, you get a paper about white privilege that talks about something like that. It's like gender roles in the third world, how these are examples of white supremacy, or economic exploitation in the Congo and how this is an example of Western supremacy. Write a counter article to that, right? You go by that point by point, give a different perspective on each of their arguments, because generally we agree that the problem exists, but who benefits and how it's structured and so on, that's different. That's the different perspective of right and left. And I think the only person who does this is Teal Deer, he calls himself, TLDR, and also a deer that is colored teal. But he mostly engages with papers from the humanities. He goes through these really ridiculous peer-reviewed studies where they talk about queering the public space and these sorts of things. And he does this for laughs, to just look at how ridiculous the left is. I think that's productive to an extent, but it's not really in-depth engaging with their arguments. And I think I think it's valuable to somewhat engage with their arguments, because living in completely parallel worlds where the left doesn't know what our viewpoints are, we don't really understand what their viewpoints are. Of course, the right, as has been proven in many papers, like there's this paper, I've got a reading of it on my channel, the different moral viewpoints of conservatives versus liberals or something like that. And conservatives generally know what leftists think a lot better than vice versa. But I don't think we often understand how these arguments are structured and what their rhetoric behind it is and so on, and where these things are coming from. So again, valuable to look at. So that'd be my advice if you want to maybe start a channel or something like that. If you want to write some things, it might be an interesting thing to do, to just go through, or engaging with leftists in your family, or friends. Find out what they're actually coming from, talk about environmentalism, talk about these economic issues, and give them a different perspective on things. Because that generally, if these are intellectually honest people, they'll try, and a difference of perspective can make them think. Whereas just, etiolating, giving your own viewpoint and why they're wrong is less productive. So, yeah, that's that. I'd say. Oh yeah, another example for example, Hollywood. Hollywood movies are everywhere, whereas domestic production of movies in many countries is declining and declining. Think of China, Japan, France. These used to have some movie industry of their own, but that's taken over more and more by the international movie scene. So that's another example of supposed white supremacy. But again, who runs Hollywood? It's not white people. Does it benefit white people that Hollywood dominates the global movie industry? Not really, does it?